thanks for coming to intermission. We are moving through the book of Mark. The last few weeks, we've talked about specific healings within the book of Mark, which really, it resonates with us in healthcare quite quickly, right? So the story of Jesus, engaging in healings. 2 weeks ago, they talked about the 4 friends that lowered the paralyzed man through the roof of a house for Jesus to heal him. And the big revelation to me in that conversation was from Alex saying that was actually Jesus' house. I had never thought about it in that way. Someone ripped the roof off of Jesus' house in order to lower somebody in for Jesus to heal. And that's just a really incredible story. Last week, Randy Spire was here and spoke with us about the healing of the man with the withered arm, about how it wasn't a critical or an emergency healing, but Jesus decided to do it on Sabbath anyway. This week, we aren't dealing anything with healing. We're dealing with something completely different. So I'm going to just start, and what we're going to do today is we have 20 verses from Mark chapter 4 that we're going to go through, and it's going to be really simple flow. We're just going to read through it, and we're going to talk about it. That's kind of what we're going to do here this morning. The story that we're going to be reading through is a very common story. Everyone's probably heard it a couple of times. It's about the generous sower and the various soils, 4 soils to be exact. So I'm going to read Mark 4, 1 through 9. He went back to teaching by the sea. By he, it's referring to Jesus, just for those that might be wondering. Jesus went back to teaching by the sea. A crowd built up to such a great size that he had to get into an offshore boat. Didn't know there was a different type of boat. Using the boat as a pulpit, other than a Cadillac, I guess, that is a different kind of boat. As a pulpit, the people pushed to the water's edge. He taught by using stories, many stories. I want to pause there. I think there's something that we can learn from this. Jesus taught by using stories. Why did Jesus use so many stories? Throughout the book, the stories of Jesus constantly comes back to stories. We often refer to them as parables. Actually, later in this story, you'll see, and we'll read it, the disciples even asked him, so Jesus, what's up with the stories? Why so many stories? And he explains a little bit why he uses stories. But the truth is stories have an incredible amount of power behind them. Because people have an ability to connect to stories in a different way, right? Everyone attaches in some different way to a story. The interesting thing, other than this story that we're going to talk about, Jesus usually doesn't explain his stories. Jesus just tells them and then just lets them sit. I don't know about you, but that usually is very frustrating to people. You know, I had a friend that she could not stand this pastor because he never answered any questions. He would never answer any questions. He would never provide a roadmap. He would never button everything up. He would leave you at the end of your sermon with more questions than you went into the sermon with. And it was incredibly frustrating because what we want is just answers, right? Just give us the answers, let us know what they are, and allow us to go on about our lives. But the truth is questions are oftentimes more valuable than answers. The right questions that make you think about things differently, the questions that make you process and debate things differently, those almost have more value than just giving answers. So growing up, there were 6 of us guy cousins about the same age that grew up in Africa. Early on, about high school age actually, we established something we called the rules of engagement. Have I told any of you about the rules of engagement? Originally, the rules of engagements were established to deal with dating relationships. So there were 6 of us guy cousins about the same age, and we had to say, okay, we just need to put some rules in place here. And the rules were quite simple. If somebody dates a girl, she's off limits to everyone else forever. Forever. I mean, it was pretty serious. Forever off limits. And it even went one step further. If there was a girl that had an interest, she had one shot to choose. If she chose poorly, she was off limits forever. It was intense, and actually, to my knowledge, it was only broken once, and we didn't take it that seriously. Those 2 people just didn't speak to each other for like 3 years. But not too big. Anyway, the point is, we established rules of engagement. There was a second rule in those rules of engagement. The second one was the storyteller gets to own the story. We had an issue because we all had the same experiences of someone standing in front of a group of people telling a story and everyone else would start to correct them. Has that ever happened to you? Right? Someone starts to correct you mid-story. What does that do? Instantly. Story's over. Right? Story's over. You're cut off at the knee. Oh, actually, that's not what happened. This happened. Actually, that's not the way it went down. That's the way it went down. Story's over. And then what? I still see it to this day. I see couples that haven't established the rules of engagement. This happens, and what happens instantly? You just go ahead and tell the story. Right? That's what inappropriate. And so the rules were established. It doesn't matter how inaccurate the thing is. You do not correct it. You can retell the story your way, some other time, some other place. But the story is owned by the storyteller. That was the rule. And actually, when I got married, we had a little bit of a learning curve, my wife and I. There was a couple, I was like, okay, let's talk about the rules of engagement. We are not going to be sit down. We're not going to be corrected mid-story because you're finished the second that happened. Later, we added a third rule of engagement. The third rule is you can't go running to Google. Okay? No escape. So if you get in a good debate, anybody can go and Google the answers. That was inappropriate. You do not go to Google and find the answers. You have to be able to process it. You have to be able to argue about it. You need to even be willing to admit you were wrong around something you know you were right. It sounds ridiculous, right? My dad and I, because my dad is a huge believer in these rules, my dad and I have had extensive, I'm talking hours-long debates about things I know I could find the answer in 30 seconds. It allows us to process through things differently. It's too easy this day and age to run to Google and conclude that's the answer, let's move on in life. It's too easy to think that you have all of the answers to a story the way that things go down. I think a part of Jesus' model of teaching through stories is recognizing the processing is half of the battle. The thinking through and churning over and trying to figure out what's Jesus saying here. What is coming out of that? I'm going to find something I'm going to attach to. I'm going to have to think about it as I go to bed tonight. There aren't just going to be answers thrown out. I mean, we're talking about what some believe to be the Son of God. He has answers, but he doesn't give them. He gives stories, and he gives questions, and he gives things to think about. The tie here, I think, for us, that is pretty incredible, is we've changed our mission statement lately. We changed it from sharing God's love to living God's love. We changed it from telling people what we believe to living your story. Live your story and allow your story to be the narrative that people can read into. There's not pressure in this organization for you to go out and evangelize. In fact, I had someone in this organization reach out to me and say, how do I convince my friends? If you start with that, you're already finished. There's no convincing. Just be. Just be, just live, and allow that story to be interpreted. Let's move forward here. Listen what do you make of this? And this is the Message Bible for those that are like, this is a funny version. A farmer planted seed. As he scattered the seed, some of it fell on the road and the birds ate it. Some fell in the gravel. It sprouted quickly, but it didn't put down roots. So when the sun came up, it withered just as quickly. Some fell in the weeds. As it came up, it was strangled among the weeds, and nothing came of it. Some fell on good earth and came up with a flourish, producing a harvest exceeding his wildest dreams. Are you listening to this? Really listening? And that's where it ended. So we have a whole bunch of context when we read this story, most of us that have kind of read through the Bible. And so we know, okay, when we read it, our mind's already spinning about what it means. But this is where the story ended. So imagine this huge group of people pressing up against the water, and this is what Jesus drops on them. They have to walk away from this trying to figure out what is being talked about right now. What is he saying? In fact, the very next section takes us to the disciples with those same thoughts. So here are the disciples. These are the closest people to Jesus that are wrestling with this. And the second they have a quiet time with Jesus, this is the conversation. When they were off by themselves, those who were close to him, along with the 12, asked about the stories. What's the deal with the stories, Jesus? You keep telling us all these stories. And this is what Jesus tells them. He told them, you've been given insight into God's kingdom. You know how it works. But those who can't see it yet, everything comes in stories, creating readiness, nudging them towards receptive insight. These are people whose eyes are open but don't see a thing, whose ears are open but don't understand a word, who avoid making an about face and getting forgiven. I think oftentimes we use Scripture to create the in club and the out club, right? This is the in club, the people that understand, the people that believe the way we believe, and that's the out club. What I find so interesting about this is Jesus tells stories so that he can be as inclusive as possible. He's not looking to exclude. He's not looking to start dropping theological points that make people feel uncomfortable. The reason he's telling stories is these people aren't ready for a great deal of depth right now. There are going to be pieces of this that they can connect with, and that is going to nudge them in the direction that I would have them go. If I just came out and talked about the reality, it would be too much for all of us to bear. So how can we, as we think about the story that we're living, are there moments that we are trying to create that I'm special, I'm the in crowd, somehow I've got it all sorted out, and it's too much for those that are outside of my community? Or can we create an inclusive place where people can experience the love of God and not feel like, hey, that's way too much for me to get involved with right now? This is a powerful component of the story. This is an inclusive move by Jesus to say we need to use stories so that people can find something that resonates with them. So then he goes through the parable. He continued, do you see how this story works? All my stories work this way. The farmer plants the word. So let's pause. What's the word? Right? We like to drop these terms, and these terms exist within the Bible. The farmer plants the word. What's he even talking about? And I'm not going to get into all the text, but if you read John 1, essentially he's talking about himself. Jesus is talking about him and the narrative that he's come to live. And this is the tie for us here at Adventist Health. The narrative Jesus came to live was God's love. That was what that narrative was. Jesus came to be a living representation of what God's love was supposed to look like. Because the religious people at the time had twisted it all up into something nasty. I would contend that many of us as religious people in this country have done the same thing today. We've twisted it into what we want it to be, and Jesus came to set the record straight about what God's love looked like. So when he says the farmer plants the word, what he's saying here is, this is my story. This is a story of me having come to this place to be a representation of God's love, and it's going to resonate with some, and it's not going to resonate with others. Some people are like the seed that falls on hardened soil of the road. This is just my curiosity as I start to read Scripture. Why the road? Why doesn't he just call out hardened soil? Some people are like seed that falls on hard soil. Why does he use the road? And I'm not saying that this is the reason. So let me just state that. But perhaps the road has special relevance. Why is soil on the road hard? Because it gets beat up by people, right? It gets pounded by people. It gets constant traffic. It gets this constant experience of life, if you will, at which point it creates this hard atmosphere. And so sometimes this seed will fall on the hardened soil of the road, and no sooner do they hear the word than Satan snatches away what has been planted in them. I don't know about you, but I find when people go through life and get beat up by life, they go one of two ways. Either they start to realize how little they know, right? As you start getting beat up by life, I feel like I was at the pinnacle of what I knew when I was about 14 years old. I knew everything at 14 years old. I knew what was right. I knew what was wrong. I knew what was in, what was out. I knew all of the right answers when I was 14. The longer I've gone into life, the more I realize how little I truly know. The more I realize how much there is still to learn, and the more I realize how all of those things I thought were unchangeable truths, there might be some difference in those types of mindsets. That's one path. I've seen people go a different path. When they start getting beat up by life, they conclude, this is what black looks like, this is what white looks like. And they start to shut down. They start to callous, and they start to get hard, and they start to refuse to accept anything new. I don't know if you've ever had a friend like this. They are impossible to have a conversation with. Right? Because the second you try having any type of logical conversation about anything, it's just, nope, that's wrong, this is right. Anything you say, I'm not going to process it because it's just not the way it is. That's wrong, this is right. I dated a girl like this once. Let's just be clear. I almost went crazy. You could never have a logical conversation and process through it because at any given point it was, you're wrong. You're wrong. And how do you conclude that I'm wrong? Because I'm right. That's the mindset. And so the interesting thing to me in this text is who Jesus is talking about here is most likely the religious leaders of the time. The religious leaders of the time were the ones that had it concluded they had everything figured out. They had it all figured out. So here comes Jesus with an alternate model, an alternate picture of what God's love looks like. And Pharisees, Sadducees, the religious leader of this time said, nope, not for us. We already have hardened the soil around what is in and what is out and what God looks like, and we are not interested in your new model. So oftentimes I think we look at this and we think, oh, those are the non-religious people that have no interest in religious things. No. These are just as often the religious people that feel like they have all of the religious things figured out, and they are not interested in how God is moving in their lives right here and right now. And some are like the seeds that land in the gravel. When they first hear the word, they respond with great enthusiasm. But there is such shallow soil of character that when the emotions wear off and some difficulty arrives, there is nothing to show for it. I call this life ADD. Do any of you suffer with life ADD? I had a friend in college, worst case of life ADD I've ever seen. In a course of about a year, he was in and out of everything with 100% enthusiasm. At first, it was rock climbing. And if you've ever rock climbed, this guy went out and bought all the trad gear, everything you can imagine, because he was into rock climbing. 2 months later, I said, hey, how's rock climbing going? Oh, rock climbing's out, kayaking's in. Went out and bought the best possible kayak that you can buy. Before he got it, kayaking was out, road cycling was in. Went and bought this multi-thousand road cycle, and then he rode, okay, I'll commit. He rode that for about 2 months before he decided road cycling was out, lacrosse was in. Like, what in the world, man? Lacrosse was out, soccer was in. It was just constant. It was constant with him. It was always the next thing. And what does that create? No skill in anything. Right? We live in a world, and I'm not even going to say this is a new phenomenon because Jesus called it out then. So I'm going to say it's been constant. We live in a world that lacks discipline, lacks commitment, does not want to invest the long term, wants the easy and fast route. If you've ever read books like Freakonomics or Outliers, they talk about the 10,000-hour rule, how long it truly takes to build expertise in something. We don't want to do that. Shoot, we've even taken dating and turned it into a transactional relationship online by swiping one way or the other. We do not want to invest time, but there are certain things you cannot accomplish without investing time. Things that require discipline. One of my favorite quotes from Arnold, the man, is this. Someone asked him once, why do you do what you do? And this was his answer. A well-built physique is a status symbol. It reflects you worked hard for it. No money can buy it. You cannot borrow it. You cannot inherit it. You cannot steal it. You cannot hold on to it without constant work. It shows discipline. It shows self-respect. It shows patience, work ethic, and passion. That's why I do what I do. I would argue relationships and relationships with God are the same. You can't buy it. You can't reference it. You can't search it on Google. It takes time. It takes investment. It takes discipline. It takes a depth of character that Jesus is trying to call out. We struggle with life ADD. The third type of soil. The seed cast in the weeds represents the ones who hear the kingdom news but are overwhelmed with worries about all the things they have to do and all the things they want to get. The stress strangles what they heard and nothing comes of it. I find this really interesting. What's the difference between this soil and good soil? What's the difference between soil that weeds flourish in and good soil? Nothing. Weeds grow in good soil. That's where weeds grow. The only difference between good soil and this soil is somebody cared to tend the good soil. Somebody decided to grow something different in the good soil. So really, the character, the personality, none of that has any difference. The only difference is what you choose to grow. That's the only difference between the two. What are we choosing to grow? And not to take the analogy too far, but I grew up on a farm in Zambia, so anyone that's ever farmed knows there's only so much that soil has to offer, right? Soil has to invest nutrients and energy into something. It's going to invest it into something. So my question is, what are you investing that nutrient into? What are you investing that energy into? Because it's going to grow something, and it's going to grow what you choose for it to grow. There's no real difference between weeds or what God is trying to plant in our lives. It's just a matter of where you will allow that to grow. And then finally, but the seed planted in the good earth represents those who hear the word, embrace it, and produce a harvest beyond their wildest dreams. This one's pretty self-explanatory, right? So just a couple of comments, and then we'll wrap up here. The first comment, why is this relevant to us as Adventist Health? Our mission statement declares that we exist to live God's love. If we do not foster personally a place for God's love to grow in our own lives, we don't have a chance for the world to see it in our organization. What grows here in each and every one of us is what grows for Adventist Health. It's just the way it goes. This is a calling out of what it takes for us to grow God's love. Secondly, I have often read this section of texts as a definition of different people. I don't think that's true. Because I can personally tell you, at different points in my life, I have been every version of these soils. And at any given point, I find myself maybe having one or two of these different soils in my life. So I think it's a constant process for us to determine, A, how are we going to respond to life when it's pounding us? B, how are we going to respond to the ADD of life that constantly calls us to step into the next thing, to not stick with discipline? 3, what are we going to do with the time and energy that we have, the depth of soil that does exist? Are we just going to allow weeds to grow, whatever life decides is important? Are we just going to allow that to grow? Or are we going to be intentional about farming our lives to make sure we're growing the things we want to see grown? And finally, if we do allow and do take the time to make that a reality, are we willing and ready to accept what it looks like for a harvest beyond our wildest dreams? I don't think it's an incredibly complex section of Scripture, but I think it does challenge us to some really key things that make us think. I don't have any answers. These are questions I woke up this morning asking myself. Am I going to process through these questions, and what am I going to do about it? So I think the challenge today is fight the ADD. Don't let life shut you down by just becoming hard and refusing to accept new things. Don't just let whatever random thing falls into your life grow, but be intentional about what you want to grow. And get ready for a type of outburst beyond your wildest dreams. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for the time that we could come together today and focus on you. Thank you for this message and for the challenge that's embedded in it. Bless us today as we go about our work, and give us a restful weekend so that we can come back and continue to serve. Thank you for loving us. We ask these things in your name.